where we will paste the text of the inscription and we will hide that word with question marks.
On January 9, 2025, filmmaker Mel Gibson sat down with Joe Rogan and revealed what 20 years of audiences had completely overlooked about the most controversial religious film ever made. What Mel Gibson said in that room didn't just surprise Joe Rogan. It forced millions of people to rethink a film they thought they already understood. My contention is, when I was making it, it was like, you're making this film and the idea was that we're all responsible for this, that his sacrifice was for all mankind. The Passion of the Christ grossed over $612 million worldwide. It was filmed entirely in dead languages. Every major Hollywood studio refused to touch it, and for 20 years, audiences believed they knew what it was about. They were wrong. When Gibson sat down with Joe Rogan on January 9, 2025, he pulled back a curtain that had been closed for 2 decades. The violence, the controversy, the anti-Semitism accusations, the lightning strikes on set, all of it had distracted the world from a message hidden in plain sight, encoded in every frame, placed there deliberately by a filmmaker who spent years in theological consultation with priests before a single camera rolled. Most viewers left the theater shaken by what they saw. Almost none of them understood what they were actually looking at. What Gibson revealed to Rogan that night changes everything. The story of how the Passion of the Christ came to exist is, in itself, one of the strangest origin stories in cinema history. And to understand what millions of viewers missed, you have to start at the beginning, not at the crucifixion, but at the collapse of a man. By the late 1990s, Mel Gibson was one of the most powerful people in Hollywood. Braveheart had won 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director. He was commanding tens of millions of dollars per film. He was, by every external measure, at the peak of his profession, and he was falling apart. Gibson has spoken openly, including on the Rogan episode, about the emptiness he felt during those years. The alcohol, the addiction, the sense that the rewards of Hollywood success were somehow accelerating an internal collapse rather than preventing it. He has described appealing to a power outside himself as the thing that saved his life. "I don't think it's any secret that I'm flawed in my nature," he told Rogan. "Having been born an alcoholic, I did drugs, I did alcohol, and there was nothing that could stop me from doing that. It's that I was able to appeal to something beyond myself helped me stop. Out of that crisis came an obsession." Gibson began studying the final 12 hours of Jesus Christ's life with the intensity of a detective on a cold case. He consulted theologians. He read the 4 canonical Gospels in their original languages. And then he discovered a text that would change the entire architecture of the film he was about to build. The book was called The Dolorous Passion of Our Lord Jesus Christ, published in 1833. It is a written account of the detailed mystical visions of Blessed Anne Catherine Emmerich, a German Augustinian nun who lived from 1774 to 1824. Emmerich, recognized as a mystic by the Catholic Church, reported experiencing vivid, granular visions of the crucifixion, events not recorded in Scripture, as sensory details that no historian had documented, emotional states of the figures present that the Gospels never described. Gibson later said he came across the Emmerich text almost by accident. He treated the discovery as a sign. Father John Bartonek, a young seminarian studying theology in Rome when Gibson arrived to film, ended up embedded with the production for 2 years. He was on set daily. He accompanied Gibson through post-production. He later wrote a book, Inside the Passion, specifically because, as he put it, there was so much written about the film and so much talked about that he felt the real story of what Gibson was building had been completely buried. The filming took place in the Italian towns of Matera and Krakow, ancient, austere settlements of pale stone that doubled with eerie accuracy for first-century Jerusalem. And walk those streets today and the resemblance is still disquieting. The light falls the same way. The stone absorbs heat and radiates it back in waves. During production, the cast and crew worked in temperatures that regularly exceeded 100 degrees in full-period costume on uneven terrain. Latin Mass was celebrated every single morning before shooting began. Gibson attended without exception. Something was happening on that set that went beyond filmmaking. The production was approaching what Gibson believed was sacred territory, and he had designed every frame of the film accordingly. Here is where the story shifts, because when Gibson told Joe Rogan that audiences had missed the point, he wasn't being falsely modest, he was being technically precise. The single greatest misunderstanding of the Passion of the Christ, and the one that generated most of the controversy, most of the theological debate, and most of the hostile critical reviews, was this. People thought the violence was the point. It was not the point. The violence was the language. Gibson explained to Rogan that the graphic brutality of the film was never intended to shock audiences into reverence. It was designed to communicate something that words, even the words of the four gospel writers, could not adequately convey. The film, he said, was built around a question that had haunted him personally. What did it actually cost? Film is visceral, Gibson said during an earlier interview around the film's release. It has the power to draw you in and have you experience something on an emotional level that you may not be able to logically explain. Yet the suffering depicted on screen is not a torture record. It is, according to Gibson and the theological framework he built the film around, a visual representation of what sin does to a human soul. Every wound, every cut, every blow. Each one represents not a Roman soldier's cruelty, but the accumulated weight of human failing across all of time. Father Bartunek put it plainly. The violence is what sin looks like from the inside. It destroys, it disfigures, it makes something beautiful unrecognizable. Most critics reviewed a war film. They were watching something else entirely. If you're finding this as gripping as we do, a like on this video genuinely helps us keep these investigations going. Now, the layer beneath the violence. Because Gibson didn't stop at one encoded message. He built the film as a theological document. Yes, and almost no one read it that way. Consider the figure of Satan. Throughout the film, the devil appears as an androgynous, pale, almost beautiful figure played by Italian actress Rosalinda Celentano. No horns, no conventional darkness, an unsettling, calm, watching presence. Gibson made this choice deliberately. Evil, in his framework, is not ugly. It is a corruption of beauty. It presents itself as reasonable, as calm, as almost loving. The horror is not in the appearance. The horror is in what lies beneath. And then there is the scene that generated the most confusion, the one that audiences and critics couldn't make sense of. During the flagellation sequence, one of the most difficult scenes in the film to watch, Satan suddenly appears carrying a child. The child is distorted, wrong-looking, ugly in a way that is hard to define. Yet the image appears for only moments before the film cuts back to the torture of Jesus. Audiences were baffled. Critics called it bizarre. A number of reviewers dismissed it as a directorial misstep. It was none of those things. According to Father Bartunek, who asked Gibson directly, the image is an intentional inversion of the Madonna and Child, one of the most recognizable symbols in Christian art. In Christian iconography, the Madonna cradling the infant Christ represents the origin of redemption, the love of a mother. Gibson reversed the image deliberately. Satan holding that misshapen child represents the anti-church, the future persecution of the body of Christ. The child is ugly, Bartunek explained, because evil is a deformation of good, and the stroking of Satan's face by the child is a perversion of the tenderness between a mother and an infant. And the timing of the image, appearing precisely as Jesus is being scourged on his chest, is not accidental. It appears at the moment of maximum suffering to show Satan flaunting his plan in the face of the sacrifice meant to undo it. Gibson placed this image in the film and then said almost nothing about it publicly. For 20 years it sat there, waiting for someone to ask. The second layer runs deeper. Notice something about Satan's position throughout the film. Gibson gave Father Bartunek very specific direction about this. In every scene of aggression toward Jesus, the arrest, the beating, the trial, the crucifixion itself, Satan is never in the foreground. Satan is always in the background, moving, watching, present, but not principal. This was a theological statement about the nature of evil. Gibson's belief, encoded into the blocking and framing of the film, is that evil does not act directly. It motivates, it moves behind the scenes. The cruelty on screen is human. The engine behind it is something else, always partially visible, always receding, always operative. Most viewers watched the human drama in the foreground and never registered the figure consistently positioned behind it. There is something quietly devastating about realizing that. An entire film's thesis, expressed through camera placement, and almost no one caught it. The data was clear. The implications were anything but. Now, consider the languages. Every studio in Hollywood told Gibson the same thing. You cannot make a film in Aramaic, Latin, and Hebrew. Nobody will watch it. It will be incomprehensible. Gibson was told this so many times, and by so many people, that he has described it as something close to a consensus. This is a film about something that nobody wants to touch, he said during production, shot in 2 dead languages. He was actually wrong about the count. There are 3 ancient languages in the film, but the point stands. What Gibson understood, and what most critics missed, is that the language choice is not an authenticity gimmick. It is a theological decision. When you don't understand the words being spoken, you are forced to read faces. You watch bodies. You feel emotion rather than process information. Gibson wanted the audience to experience the crucifixion rather than follow it as a narrative. He wanted the familiar story to become unfamiliar, strange, present tense. But by stripping away comprehensible language, he stripped away the distance that familiarity creates. The audience that had heard the Easter story dozens of times, that had sat through homilies and Sunday school lessons and passion plays, could not fall back on the comfortable knowledge of how the story ends. They were placed inside it. Without a language to anchor them, they were reduced to witnesses. No studio executive in Hollywood would have sanctioned that choice. That's precisely why Gibson funded the entire production himself, $30 million of his own money with no outside backing. And here is the detail that keeps researchers up at night. Several members of the cast and crew converted to Catholicism during or immediately after production. The actor who played Judas Iscariot, Luca Lionello, arrived on set as a professed atheist, while he left a Catholic. Jim Caviezel, who played Jesus, was struck by lightning during filming. So was a set production assistant named Jan Michelini, twice. Michelini appears in the film's credits with the nickname Lightning Boy. Caviezel also dislocated his shoulder carrying the cross. He developed hypothermia. He contracted a skin infection. He later described the physical experience of the production as something that permanently altered his relationship with his faith. Gibson has never offered a theological interpretation of those events. He doesn't need to. He simply reports them. Rogan pressed Gibson on all of this, and it was in Rogan's reaction, that of a self-described agnostic raised Catholic, deeply skeptical of institutional religion, that something unexpected emerged. So Rogan has made no secret of his complicated relationship with Christianity. He agrees with Gibson that Christianity is, as he put it, the one religion you're allowed to disparage in secular culture. He noted that Hollywood is full of people who present themselves as open-minded and spiritually curious, yet treat Christian faith as uniquely retrograde, as something associated, in his words, with white male colonialism, whatever it represents. What visibly unsettled Rogan during the conversation was not the supernatural claims. It was the historical ones. Gibson told Rogan that he regards the Gospels as verifiable history, not metaphor, not useful mythology, history. He pointed to the extra-biblical accounts of Jesus, the references in Tacitus, in Josephus, in the correspondence of Pliny the Younger, yet as a foundation that goes beyond religious faith. And then he made a point that Rogan sat with invisible silence. Every single one of the apostles, Gibson said, died rather than deny their belief. Not one recanted. Not one, when faced with torture or execution, said, "We made it up. We invented a story. We constructed a movement around a man who was simply a teacher, and we can stop now, and we would like to live." None of them did that. Rogan, who approaches most subjects with a skepticism of a man trained in combat sports and devoted to empirical evidence, appeared genuinely struck by this. The argument is not a theological one. It is a historical one. People don't die for things they know to be lies. It requires the most faith and the most belief, Gibson said of the resurrection. But the behavior of those closest to the event, yes, the people who were actually there, who had everything to lose and apparently nothing to gain, is a data point that sits outside the domain of theology. It sits inside the domain of human behavior. And human behavior, Rogan understands very well. Now we come to the revelation that Gibson delivered on the Rogan episode that most people are still processing. The Passion of the Christ was never, in Gibson's framing, a film about Jewish authorities and Roman soldiers and a man named Jesus of Nazareth. That is the foreground, the story at the surface. The film is about the audience. The idea was that we're all responsible for this, Gibson told Rogan, that his sacrifice was for all mankind, and that for all our ills and all the things in our fallen nature, it was a redemption. Read that again. All of us. Not the figures in the film. And not the historical actors of first-century Jerusalem. All of us. This is the theological position at the core of traditional Christian soteriology, the doctrine of the atonement. It is not a fringe interpretation. It is what the Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, and most Protestant denominations have taught for 2,000 years. The death of Christ is understood not as the result of specific human decisions in a specific historical moment, but as a voluntary sacrifice made necessary by the entire accumulated weight of human failure across all of time. Gibson didn't just believe this theologically, he built it into the film architecturally. The unnamed Roman soldier who drives the nail through Christ's hands in the crucifixion scene, that hand belongs to Mel Gibson. He put himself in the frame, his hand, his hammer. Yet he has spoken about this choice in several interviews, though almost none of the mainstream coverage of the film ever focused on it. He was making a confession on film in front of the world. He was saying, "I did this too." Some scholars of biblical cinema, including scholars who are deeply critical of the film on other grounds, have acknowledged that this moment is among the most theologically coherent directorial choices in the history of religious filmmaking. The director placing himself as the agent of the central violence of his own film is an act of radical theological self-implication, and almost no one noticed. Here is where we step back for a moment. There are legitimate critiques of the Passion of the Christ, serious ones. Scholars from institutions including the Jewish Theological Seminary and the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops raised concerns about the film's portrayal of Jewish authorities in the period preceding the crucifixion. The Anti-Defamation League published formal objections before the film was even released. Abraham Foxman, then national director of the ADL, described the film as likely to fuel anti-Semitic sentiment. Gibson has never fully satisfied his critics on this point. His response, that the film shows multiple Jewish figures defending Jesus, that the Roman soldier who mocks Jesus as a Jew represents the most explicit bigotry in the film, as an expression of Gentile cruelty, not Jewish failure, is a substantive argument, but not one that resolved the controversy. This matters, and not because it negates what the film is doing theologically, but because the controversy itself may have been part of what buried the film's deeper architecture. The debate about anti-Semitism became the dominant frame through which the film was discussed, and while that debate was happening, the encoded symbolism, the Emmerich-derived visual theology, the deliberate camera grammar, the personal confession embedded in the director's own hands, all of it sat beneath the surface, waiting. Now we arrive at what Gibson revealed on the Rogan episode that even most faith communities have not fully reckoned with. The sequel he has been developing for over 7 years, which he confirmed on the podcast, is titled The Resurrection of the Christ, is not a continuation of the first film in any conventional sense. What Gibson described to Rogan is something closer to a theological cosmology. A film that begins, he said, with the fall of the angels, that moves through death, through what Gibson called Sheol, the Hebrew underworld, and through the resurrection itself, that ends with the death of the last apostle. That encompasses, in his telling, the entirety of spiritual history from the first rebellion in heaven to the closure of the apostolic age. It's an acid trip, Gibson told Rogan. I've never read anything like it. He has been writing the script with his brother Donal and with Randall Wallace, the writer of Braveheart, for years, 6 full drafts. The project has been in development since at least 2016, and what Gibson described to Rogan, the non-linear structure, the shifting realms, the depiction of hell, the cosmic scope, suggests that the sequel will be something no studio system would ever have commissioned, which, of course, is exactly the situation that produced the original. Jim Caviezel will return as Jesus, likely requiring digital de-aging to match his appearance from 2 decades ago. Gibson said he hopes to begin filming in 2026. He noted that his Malibu home burned to the ground in the Los Angeles fires while he was sitting in that Austin studio talking to Joe Rogan. He learned about it during the recording. He finished the interview anyway. What does it mean? All of this, taken together. One interpretation. Gibson is simply a sincere Catholic filmmaker who built a film according to his faith, whose theological decisions went unrecognized because the surrounding controversy consumed all available oxygen. A second interpretation, yet one that some theologians and film scholars have circled without quite landing on. The Passion of the Christ is the most theologically ambitious piece of religious art produced by Hollywood in the modern era. Deliberately constructed as a 2-hour meditation that operates on multiple simultaneous levels, most of which are invisible to viewers who approach it as a film rather than as a document. A third interpretation, the one that Gibson himself seems to believe and that his conversation with Rogan returned to repeatedly, is that the film was not entirely his idea, that the discovery of the Emmerich text felt like a summons, that the morning masses, the lightning strikes, the conversions of atheist cast members, the fact that a film that every studio refused to fund went on to become the highest-grossing independent film in cinema history, that none of this fits comfortably inside a framework of coincidence. Gibson does not claim divine authorship. He is too careful and too theologically precise for that, but he does not dismiss the pattern either. He reports it, and he lets the listener decide. That may be the most honest thing a filmmaker has ever said about his own work. The reason the Rogan conversation landed so hard, the reason clips from it have circulated widely, the reason it generated coverage across religious, secular, and entertainment media simultaneously, is not because Gibson said anything that hadn't been said before. The theology is ancient. The symbolism has been written about by scholars, and the behind-the-scenes facts have been documented. The reason it landed is Rogan himself. Rogan is not a Christian apologist. He is not a faith communicator. He is a skeptic who built his platform on relentlessly questioning received wisdom in science, in politics, in medicine, in sport. When someone with that profile sits across from Mel Gibson and goes quiet, genuinely quiet, not podcast quiet, but actually quiet, and says, "I never thought about it that way," something passes between them that the audience can feel. What nobody missed in the end is the emotion. The crucifixion of Jesus Christ is, as Rogan said himself, one of the most powerful stories in human history, regardless of what you believe about its metaphysical status. The story of a man who could have stopped what was happening to him, who chose not to, who endured it for reasons that his contemporaries could not fully comprehend. That story hits something in human beings that is older than Christianity. What Gibson exposed on the Rogan episode, and perhaps for the first time in the full hearing of a secular audience, is that the film he made was not an act of religious propaganda. It was not a prestige production of church doctrine. It was a personal reckoning. A man who believed he was contributing to the weight in the world, trying to look that suffering directly in the face, and ask whether forgiveness was real. He made the most successful faith film in history. He put his own hand on the hammer, and for 20 years, the world argued about the blood and missed the hand. Rogan saw the hand, which brings us to the only question that actually matters, the one that Gibson has been sitting with for 3 decades, and that the sequel is apparently being built around. Not the historical question of what happened in Jerusalem in approximately 33 AD. Not the archaeological question of whether the Gospels constitute verifiable testimony. Not even the theological question of what the death of one man might mean for the fate of everyone else. The question Gibson is asking is smaller than all of those, and larger. It's the question he was asking when he put his own hand in the frame. If you were there, if you had been standing outside the city walls on that specific afternoon, watching what was happening, what would you have done?